But first, the Coate Inquiry into Victoria's hotel quarantine fiasco is said to be resisting pressure to reopen hearings and to recall witnesses. It's knocked back written requests from the opposition and others to recall witnesses. And overnight, it's written to all the barristers representing the MPs and officials caught up in this inquiry, all costing the taxpayer many millions, I might add, to remind them none so politely that this inquiry will decide, it'll decide how it handles its investigation and that it won't be told what to do. Indeed, it's gone as far as this to say in the letter, in nice legal terms, of course, don't contact us, we'll contact you, and only then we'll have further information by way of submission or written form alone. Now, really. So we've got nothing more publicly until we get the final report. No more witnesses, no more interrogation of the evidence. If, as I'm coming more and more to the view, there was even much interrogation in the first place. No one should have to tell any proper inquiry how to do its job, but given what's happened in recent days, there's serious questions about how serious this inquiry is about finding out the truth. For some time, I'd been calling for the phone records to be made available. It's not rocket science. In fact, these are officials and ministers. The more they told the inquiry that they couldn't remember, the more they actually elevated the argument that these records need to be released. Over the weekend, 3 months on since this inquiry was first announced, it finally got around to asking for phone records. Now, not everyone was asked. Lots of ministers and departments, well, they still haven't been asked for their phone records. But as we know, the Premier and his office, and now his former head public servant, Chris Eckles, have been asked. Of course, the Premier, at any time, could have freely offered his phone records to the inquiry, as could and should every other minister, staffer and official caught up in all of this. After all, the Premier says, doesn't he, says that often enough, he set up this inquiry to find out the truth. But he never did. Not until he was pushed. Now, I don't want to sound disrespectful to the former judge running this inquiry, but so far, this all looks like a Premier and a Board of Inquiry doing the least they have to do rather than the most they have to do to actually get to the truth. As we now know after yesterday's shock resignation of the head of the Premier's department, if his inquiry hadn't finally sought phone records, we wouldn't know, would we? That Mr Eckles had himself been the one to call the then Police Commissioner in that vital 6-minute window on Friday the 27th of March, between when the Commissioner still thought Victoria Police would be running hotel quarantine and when, obviously relieved, he told his federal counterpart that no, Victoria Police would not be handling it, it would be private security instead. Now, lucky, isn't it, that the inquiry wasn't deterred from asking for phone records by the fact that people like me demanded that they were produced. Likewise, this inquiry must not be deterred from seeking to re-examine witnesses by the fact that this is also now being publicly called for more and more. Now, given the meagre results of the inquiry up until about 10 days ago, and what we now know, it would be a travesty if witnesses were not re-examined, or indeed some called for the first time. And I have to say, as I've been talking to people in and around Melbourne's legal circles, there's growing embarrassment, not just about what this inquiry isn't asking for and who is not being recalled to the witness box, but also about the way in which the actual hearings were conducted by counsel assisting in the first place. You see, an inquiry is a very particular legal creation. It's not a criminal legal action, it's not a civil case. And the job of counsel insisting the inquiry, by the very name, their job is to assist the inquiry chair to get to the truth. Now, as I watched day after day of evidence, and now I'm rereading all the transcripts, I'm shocked at how often counsel assisting appeared to have basically just read back the witness statement of the witness to them, asked a couple of questions, and then pretty much moved on. Now, that's not what's supposed to happen. In an inquiry, the job of counsel assisting is to put propositions to the witness, to test the witness's written statement against their oral evidence while they're in the box, to push and probe, to cross-examine them, if you like. Now, this hasn't happened hard enough, often enough, and with every single witness, I reckon, regardless of their power and status, they must be put under pressure. And because it hasn't happened, I don't know, counsel assisting must have done a different law degree than one I did. And two, in their closing submissions, this is from counsel assisting, this rubbish about a creeping assumption. Let's hit that one square on the head. Every minister is sworn into their job by the Governor of Victoria, and they're sworn in under law to have authority over specific pieces of legislation or acts of Parliament. Now, every act they have carriage of is specified in something called the administrative orders. It's not collective authority. It's one minister with a Bible in their hand, sworn in, and in government, decisions are made by that minister under those specific laws. Paper gets signed off, contracts get signed off, and taxpayer money gets spent, all via the administrative order authority. Now, I can follow a government paper trail as good as anyone. Let me assure you, let me assure my viewers, let me assure every Victorian, I am pursuing this uphill and down dale. But look, there's no doubt that given much more has come to light since the hearings closed, Justice Coate must urgently reopen hearings and call witnesses back. Given that every other state used police and military personnel to run hotel quarantine, once this was agreed, as you'll recall, back on Friday the 27th of March out of that National Cabinet, it's simply not credible that Victoria went off on a frolic of its own without anyone making a specific decision to do this. Remember that critical 6-minute period between 1:16 p.m. and 1:22 p.m. on that fateful Friday? Ashton thought he'd had a call from someone in that time, but he couldn't remember who. Eckles was sure he hadn't called Ashton, even though Ashton had subsequently texted the Federal Police Chief saying that it had been the Premier's department that had come up with the private security deal. Here's Ashton's text at 1:32 p.m. where he said, and I quote, "I think that's the deal done up by our DPC, or Department of Premier and Cabinet." Now, if Eckles was wrong to claim that he hadn't called Ashton, why should we believe he was right when he insisted, as he does in his resignation statement out yesterday, that he hadn't mentioned private security? And if Ashton was right to say that someone had called him, why should he be wrong when he says that the idea of private security came from the Premier's department, as he does, doesn't he, in that text I just showed you? Now, clearly, someone made this decision, and it was made by 1:22 p.m. on the Friday. And it was made by someone with enough authority to satisfy the Chief of Victoria Police, who never wanted his officers to babysit returning travellers in quarantine, as it has been suggested. Now, given this clear failure by Eckles to remember this phone call under oath, why not call him back now to see what else he might remember? And given that subsequent developments have tended to confirm Graham Ashton's testimony, why not call him back to see if his memory's now jogged? What else might he be able to remember that he perhaps couldn't remember a couple of weeks ago? Especially as the final submission from police to the inquiry couldn't have been clearer. The police submission said it wasn't a creeping assumption, that a decision definitely was made. Here it is specifically, and I quote, "A decision was made to engage private security, indeed before the 2 p.m. meeting. And that 2 p.m. meeting was the one involving the police chief, the police minister, Lisa Neville, and the Emergency Management Commissioner, Andrew Crisp." And of course, there's the Premier's Chief of Staff. Now, she was the first person Eckles briefed on the National Cabinet decision to introduce hotel quarantine when he left the room around noon, about an hour before the meeting actually ended, and spoke with the Jobs Department head, Simon Femister, who put in process this whole train of events that led to the engagement of Unified Security, one of the companies that wasn't even on the list of preferred tenderers, but that somehow got the lion's share of the work, and a $30 million contract for 3 months' work. How can this inquiry regard its job done satisfactorily without calling the Premier's Chief of Staff to give evidence. I know what Chiefs of Staff do, and let me tell you, they don't get briefed on cabinet meetings and then just sit there twiddling their thumbs. How could Femister have set up the private security contracts without having any clue as to who had authorised them? I mean, what public servant goes and spends $30 million on a single contract without being clear about who has authority to do it? And again, how could any of this have escaped detailed probing by counsel assisting the inquiry? What about the Premier himself? He announced that private security was doing the job at his press conference on Friday at 3:15, even though he now says he can't remember who made the decision. And who also likewise, in that same press conference and one the next day and a press release as well, he welcomed the offer of ADF help from the federal government, but then later on denied that a substantial offer had ever been made. Here is the Premier again, the day after the big decision on National Cabinet on the Friday. This is the Saturday, the day that the returning travellers started to come home at midnight. Well, here he is. He remembers the ADF here, doesn't he?
I mean, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping
Yeah,
people?
we'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force. I think people will do the right thing. I think people know and understand this is serious, and they're coming home because they know that this is the safest place to be.
Now, come on. Surely all of this should be reprobed by the inquiry, especially as the former Health Minister who'd listened to the Premier's evidence the day after she'd given hers, and she resigned on the strength of it. And she's issued a formal statement, closing submission to the inquiry, saying that the Premier's evidence should be, quote, treated with caution. When sworn witnesses subsequently and publicly disagree with one another, surely any inquiry that took its credibility seriously would call them back to explain, to test their evidence. As I said earlier, it's supposedly the job of counsel assisting to assist the inquiry, to put these propositions to them, to push and probe and seek the truth. Now, once it became clear that Victoria's second wave of COVID deaths had flowed from hotel quarantine, and once the Premier had set up this inquiry without the powers of a royal commission to compel the appearance of witnesses and the production of documents, and once he'd taken to avoiding answers to fair-minded questions by hiding behind this inquiry, you saw it, didn't you? Press conference after press conference. Well, the suspicion has arisen, at least in relation to the Premier, that the Coates Inquiry is not there to uncover the truth, but may end up hiding the guilty. There is really only one way for Justice Coate to dispel the impression and protect her reputation, and that's by calling people back and giving them the grilling that every Victorian wants to see happen. And heck, I tell you, if counsel assisting don't want to do it, I'll do it for free. And then something else today that I can't let go unremarked. As reported in the Herald Sun, in a rare move, the head of Victoria's IBAC, or Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, Mr Robert Redlick QC, has sent an unprompted letter to the chair of this inquiry, Jennifer Coate, providing information on corruption risks during times of emergency and outlining what would constitute illegal behaviour or misconduct by public servants. To have him point out this risk to Justice Coate is telling. This inquiry into hotel quarantine needs to do its job. It needs to be seen to be doing its job, and to do it without fear or favour, not just to honour Victoria's 800 dead, but quite frankly, help all of us around the country put some faith back into a system, I have to say, has let every Australian down.